we noticed last week that Agrippa and Bernice had come to Caesarea basically to congratulate Festus on his appointment. This was a common procedure back in those times. A number of the historians that I've read from back in those days have mentioned that, as well as a few commentators that have commented on the text. But when they came, they stayed for a while, obviously getting to know Festus a little bit, letting him get to know them a little bit. And Festus informed them about the charges that had been brought against Paul by the Jewish Sanhedrin, the elders, and also the chief priest. And I want to point out something to us. You know, sometimes we miss these little bitty things. But notice the text says chief priest, S, plural. And that was true. During that time there were two. One, the legitimate high priest according to Jewish law, and the second one who was appointed by the Romans to be there to know what was going on and also to influence the behavior and things that were done. And so all of this took place, and then that brings us down to verse 16 and 17. I'm in the wrong chapter there. Let's get back to where I'm supposed to be. To whom I answered. Festus is now continuing his telling Bernice and Agrippa about Paul. To whom I answered, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth. So he's rehearsing to Agrippa and Bernice just exactly what took place. In the manner of the Romans, the American Standard says the custom of the Romans. This deals with the right of a person to actually face their accusers, much like our law today, which says that you have a right, if you're on trial, to face your accusers. That isn't done as often as it really should be. Sometimes, in quite a few cases, in fact, those who would accuse a person are hidden from their accuser for whatever reason. The Appian, in the book The Appian, Civil Wars, it says our law, senators, requires that the accused shall himself hear the charge preferred against him and shall be judged after he has made his own adequate defense. So you see, the law of the Romans allowed a person to defend themselves. And notice he says, we don't deliver somebody to die. We don't deliver a man to death simply based on a charge. That's the idea behind what he's saying. The American Standard and the Living Oracles say to give up any man. There's an idea behind this that needs to be seen, and the Young's Literal Translation actually helps us to make this. It says to make a favor of any man to die. In other words, we don't make a favor to someone in order for them to cause the death of this individual. The word deliver comes from a Greek word that means to grant as a favor. Notice that. The original language shows us we don't grant a favor to somebody so that somebody can be killed, put to death. I will not give up anyone. I will not give someone up, Festus is saying, to be put to death simply as a favor to someone. Now remember, if he knew just a little bit of the background here, if he had had some kind of material telling him about Paul before he went down to Jerusalem, if he'd known what had already taken place and how they tried to lie and he knew exactly why they wanted to bring him down there, to put him to death. They wanted him to bring Paul back to Jerusalem. So with regard to religion, Festus would probably have subscribed to the philosophy that one religion's just as good as another. And I say that because most Romans believed in multiplicity of gods. And they would have their main god, whichever one they chose, and that would be their main god. If you watch the movie Gladiator, the main character in this, when they were getting ready to assassinate him, and by the way, he beat the charge if you hadn't seen the movie. He didn't beat the charge, he escaped by killing the man who was supposed to execute him. He had a little thing about this tall, and that was his little god. And he would hold that in his hand and pray to that god, ask for favor, etc. And most Romans had a multiplicity of gods, very much like the Greeks did. But they would choose the one they favored the most, that they thought was going to benefit them the most. He probably would have also considered that none of them are worth a whole lot. That seemed to have been a pretty much of an idea of his time. Kind of an atheism in a sense, and yet atheism is a religion. But kind of an idea that they're not worth a whole lot. And our secular society in America is getting more and more that way all the time. His religion was the power of Rome. And as time went on, by this time they were already starting to worship the emperor, and emperor worship was their religion, Rome, the power of Rome. We can do what we want. Look at verse 18 and 19 of our text. Against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusations of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Festus continues to relate to Agrippa and Bernice what had taken place in them making their charges against Paul and what was being said. Now, again, this is probably an abbreviation of what actually took place. There was probably much more to this than just the brief statements that we're looking at. It says they brought none accusation like I suppose they would have brought. He knows they want death for Paul, so what kind of accusations would he have thought, hey, this is the kind of accusation they'll bring? He must have murdered somebody. Or he must have conspired against Rome, or he must have been a rapist, a terrible rapist. He would have expected a charge, something like that. And that's what he's saying. They didn't bring a charge like I expected. The charges were, he has a different religious opinion than they have. That's basically the charge. Oh, there's a dispute they have about a man named Jesus. Specifically, he was said, they say, the Jewish leaders say that he's dead. And Paul says he's alive. Well, he can't be dead and alive both, can he? That's a trick question. He was alive, but he was also dead, wasn't he? Physically, he died. Spiritually, he was alive. But the Jewish leaders, they didn't want him to be alive secularly or spiritually. They didn't want him to be alive at all. Paul said he's alive. The resurrection of Jesus is absolutely the key element of Christianity. Now, I suppose some would argue with me about that. They'd say, oh, his death on the cross was the key. If he had died on the cross but had not come forth from the grave, Christianity wouldn't be worth a thing. Wouldn't be worth a thing. because the promise of eternal life with God could not exist. Superstition. This word really can refer to one of two things. The original word was used to signify demon worship, or it could be used to signify religion in general, which could be true or false. When we look at when we look at verses 20 through 22, and because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus Caesar Nero, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. And then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. So Festus suggested to Agrippa that his reason for suggesting a trial in Jerusalem was because of their questions. But we know that's not the case. He wasn't questioning that. He was trying to do them, as we saw already through the original language, to deliver, that is, as a favor to them, to do something for them. He was willing to do that. Agrippa said he wanted to hear Paul too. I've thought about that and thought, Agrippa, Bernice, brother, sister of the family of Herod the Great, of the family of Agrippa the First, horribly evil people. Festus does what any Roman would probably have done. Let's do it tomorrow. Let's get it done. What would Agrippa, why would Agrippa, and what would Agrippa want to hear from Paul about this man Jesus? Remember, the text shows us that Festus had told them that the questions were all about this Jesus. So he knows Paul's going to talk about this Jesus. What would he want to know? McGarvey gave us, I think, an interesting statement. He said, could it be true that the gulf between Christ and this bloodiest of families was so nearly bridged that one of them really desired to hear the gospel? Because that's what he's going to hear from Paul. We know that's the case. We may not know everything that Paul said, but we know he's going to teach him about Jesus. The word Augustus is a word that was developed as an honorary title for someone who became the Roman emperor. It began with Octavius in 27 BC. So every emperor after him was given this honorary title of Augustus. Why? Because the emperorhood, so to speak, began with Augustus. He really was the one who became the one who was first acknowledged to be, a god, and it was from his lineage that many of the emperors came until that was finally destroyed through murder and intrigue and all these other things. So it was always used of emperors after that time. And note the American Standard translated it simply as emperor. It's the same thing. It was Augustus, the emperor of the Roman Empire. I'm studying a book right now on the Roman Empire, and I'm studying it because of my reading here. And we probably, in our American society, would be amazed to see that some of the emperors only lasted a few months, and a few times 3 or 4 emperors in the same year. And sometimes multiple emperors, and of course when that happened, then there was civil war that fought at the same time. Look at verses 23 and 24. And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city, at Festus's command Paul was brought forth. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. Consider this as a fulfillment of what we see in Matthew chapter 10, verses 18 through 20. What did Jesus tell the apostles? You're going to be brought before who? Governors and kings. Who's he before now? Festus, governor, and Agrippa, a king. And it's going to be for a testimony, Jesus said, against the Gentiles. How so? Well, Festus, a Gentile, Agrippa, basically a Gentile, they're not going to listen. That is, to obey. There's no indication that either one of them ever obeyed the gospel. They are representative of the Gentiles. And the gospel being taught to the Gentiles and them rejecting it is a testimony against them for rejecting what God has given. But when they deliver you up, he said, don't take any thought about what you're going to say. We mentioned this last week, I think it was, in the class, that wouldn't it have been wonderful for us who are preachers not to have to think about and plan and develop sermons and all this, just boom, there it is. That's not the way it works. But for them, in that time of the miraculous age, when proof needed to be made that they actually were speaking God's truths, not only were the miracle of being able to be told exactly what to say before those they were tried before, but also miracles of healing and other things were done to prove that what they said was the truth. It's going to be delivered to you, Jesus told them. How? Through the Holy Spirit. Going to tell them exactly what to say, so that there could be no mistake. In all the years that I used to go to Indonesia to teach at the college over there, I always used an interpreter, even though toward the end of the time when I could no longer go over there, I pretty much knew what they were saying. But I didn't want to make a mistake because I didn't know how to speak their language in the fullest sense of the word. Well, the Holy Spirit made sure the apostles didn't make a mistake. Told them exactly what to say. And here's a fulfillment of that prophecy. And I'm sure it was fulfilled many times over. Jesus said that their words would be a testimony against them. Who? The Gentiles, who were Agrippa and Festus and Bernice. Now, Bernice's mother was a Jew, so technically, according to the way the Jews thought about it, so was Agrippa's, by the way. They were brother and sister. Technically, by the Jewish way of reckoning, they were Jews. But they came from Herod's family, and that was another story altogether. So how did Agrippa and Bernice come to this hearing? I think it's very revealing. They didn't come to really learn. They're going to make a show of this. They came in pageantry. They're dressed to the nines, as we would say today. Their riches and their splendor were being shown. Hey, look at me. You know, we see people today with purple hair You know what they're doing? They're just saying, look at me. It's the same thing. Or we'll see them with things in, metal things in their nose and in their lip and in their eyebrows. What are they doing? It's just saying, look at me. Same thing that Agrippa and Bernice were doing. And notice the guest list. The chief captains. These would have been the tribunes. The principal men of the city, the dignitaries of the city. This audience will be portraying themselves as being rich and powerful. We're the people who are the elites. Do we see that today sometimes? Ever see somebody say on a game show as the host dress in clothes that you knew must have cost at least $1,000? Look at me. I'm the rich. I'm the elite. Paul was brought before them as a prisoner in chains. He wasn't all dressed up. Well, that's the way those who are in power and the elite act, isn't it? They don't care about who they're dealing with so much. In their estimation, Paul was not a very important person. He's just a chained prisoner. In 1 Corinthians 1:25, the foolishness of God is wiser than men. Who did God choose to be those who were His ambassadors? To take His message, chosen men, especially chosen to take His message to the world around them. Men who were not highly educated like these in the Roman court of Festus. Prisoners, men who were humble in nature, who were willing to sacrifice themselves to get His message across. The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. You see, these dignitaries, these centurions and others, this king and this governor, they're the ones who are truly foolish in rejecting the Christ. Festus said, "See this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews, they've all been after me about him. They've been pestering me." You see, Festus fell into the same trap that many fall into today, according to Roper. All the Jews he had talked to had denounced Paul. And so he said all the Jews wanted Paul dead. Do we see that same kind of thing today? These polls that we saw so many of in the leading up to our past election, who did they talk to get the results that said that Trump didn't have a chance to be the next elected president? That could have only come from people that they talked to, whom they felt. You see, it's the same kind of thing that went on way back then. The Jews, notice their demand of Festus: put him to death. We don't want him. He doesn't deserve to be alive. Do what we want you to do. And they portrayed themselves as being the majority of people who wanted Paul put to death. That wasn't the case at all. Look at verse 25 and 27 through 27. "But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to say unto my Lord, Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and specifically before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. Festus continues to recount the story of Paul to Agrippa. And he says Paul hadn't committed anything worthy of death. He didn't deserve to be put to death. And I didn't give him over to them as a favor to them to put him to death. Now we know what was behind that. By this time, Augustus again had become a part of the title of the Roman emperors. He was Augustus Nero. Now, I'm not going to go through the rest of his name. He had, if memory serves me right, I think he had a total of 5 names that were titles and who he was and all that. It's not important. But Festus's problem is that he didn't have something to write. He didn't know what to write as a charge against Paul to Nero. What am I going to write? And because he didn't know what to do, he says, oh, Agrippa, I'm really happy to have you look at what he's doing right now. Because he didn't do what was right by releasing a man he knew didn't deserve death and knew didn't deserve to be a prisoner, he's had a problem. I don't know what to write. He's appealed Augustus, and I have to send him to him, and I have no idea what to write as a charge against Paul. So the only thing Festus could charge him with, that really could charge him with, would have been the accusation that they said that Jesus is dead, but Paul says he's alive. What else could he write? This charge would have been laughed out of court, wouldn't it? Can't you just see Nero having Paul stand before him and says, okay, what's the charge? And whoever was the guy who did that in their court, get up and say, well, I don't have any charge against him. Can't you just see Nero, how angry he probably was, wasting his precious time? And can't you just think about what he would think of Festus? He sent me a man for a possible capital offense and nothing to write about him? What a fool that man is. We need to recall him. Festus also, notice, is flattering Agrippa. Maybe you know so much about this Jewish religion. Well, why did Agrippa II, that's who this is, know so much about the law of the Jews? Well, he was in charge of the temple. So he would have to know all of the intelligence of the temple, their laws, so that he could make sure that Rome didn't do something that would start a riot. He'd have to know about all their festivities, their holidays, as we would think of them. And maybe he would see something that Paul had done against these Jews, and that's the idea. So I'll have something to write. And we need to remember that this was not a legal proceeding that was taking place at this time. Now, why do I say that? Because Agrippa did not have authority to reverse the content or conduct of the trial here. The one he had where Paul had said, I appeal to... He couldn't reverse that. It couldn't be reversed. He had to send Paul to Nero. And since Paul had appealed to him, a new trial could have been held. No new verdict could have been given. For it seemeth to me unreasonable, he said, to send a prisoner. Yeah, it would have been unreasonable without signifying, without making a legal charge against this man. Imagine a prosecutor today charging a man with a capital crime, standing before the judge. Well, what's the charge against him? Well, I don't have any charge against him. I just think you ought to put him to death. Can you imagine that? We're going to switch over here. I think we got lots of time. Let's see, how do I do this? Ta-da! To Acts chapter 26 in verse 1. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand and answered for himself. Agrippa apparently has been given an official okay by the governor Festus to be in charge of the proceedings. Now again, we think that's backwards. We would think, the king would have to give the governor the permission, but remember, under the system, a Roman governor had more authority than a king. So he grants Paul permission, Agrippa does, to speak. Now Paul stretched forth his hand. I don't believe anything is in the scriptures without a reason. Why not just record what Paul started to say? And yet, I can't figure out what the significance of this is. I have not been able to figure that out. If one of you has a good idea, please let me know. There are several ideas that have been put forth by different people about why he stretched forth his hand. Maybe he stretched forth both of them. I'm not sure, but it wasn't used with pearl, so I'm figuring it's one hand. Maybe the other hand was the one that was chained to the Roman centurion that he would have been chained to. But there are several ideas that have been put forth to gain silence. Sometimes a speaker, will hold a hand up to get people to be quiet so that he can speak, or maybe it was to emphasize some point or that he was about to speak. Maybe it was some kind of a symbol of innocence that would be done or a gesture of respect for the court. I don't know what it was. I have not been able to come to a conclusion about that, but whatever it was, the Bible has it there for a reason. And again, I just don't understand it at this point. If you do, please, or if you have an idea about that, please let me know. Look at verse 2 through 3. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee touching all the things whereof I am accused of the Jews, especially because I know thee to be expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews. Wherefore I beseech thee to hear me patiently. So Paul begins, and this is why I kind of lean toward the idea that he was acknowledging the court when he held up his hand. But again, I don't know that for sure. But he begins by acknowledging the court with one major difference from what Tertullus did when he stood before Festus. And maybe he was the one that carried the idea to, or Felix rather, and maybe he was the one who carried the idea or the charges before Festus. We don't know. But he didn't speak flattery. He just simply spoke to teach. And he's going to compliment where he can honestly compliment. And think about that. When we try to teach somebody who maybe is an agnostic or an atheist who said that they are, or some person of another religion, shouldn't we try to compliment them where we can? Because when you look through the scriptures, you see this done a number of times. And that's not wrong. It's not a matter of flattery, it's giving them a compliment where we can. And there was a compliment that he could give to Agrippa, this extremely wicked man. And notice something else. As Paul spoke to him, he spoke with respect. I don't care who you and I talk to, we ought to show them respect, even if they are very disrespectful, even if they hold beliefs that are so contrary to ours that we just can't accept that somebody would be maybe that ignorant or that uncouth about the way they speak. I should still show them respect. Paul shows this extremely wicked man respect. He didn't denigrate him. He said, "Oh, hey, Agrippa, you old adulterer, you." Now, he can tell him. He'll tell him, probably. I don't know all that he said there, and I don't think any of us can know. But notice what he shows him respect about, and notice the compliment that he gives him. I know, I'm especially happy to stand before you and tell you what I'm going to tell you, because I know you are an expert in all the customs and questions that exist among the Jews. Remember why he would be this way? This is Agrippa II. He was the one who was actually running the Sanhedrin and the Jewish temple. It wasn't the man who had been appointed to be a high priest. It wasn't the Jews' high priest who were actually running the temple at this time. Both Josephus and, what was his name? A Roman historian. I can't think of his name offhand, but they both mentioned that Agrippa II was actually the one who was in charge of the temple, making sure that they had what they needed and all these other things, and making sure they didn't go beyond Roman law and all this stuff. It was fascinating. But he says, Agrippa, I know you're an expert. I know you're an expert in the customs of the Jews, and I know you know the questions that are always being raised among the Jews. He knew. Agrippa's father had also been interested and was a interested student of the law of Moses. That's Agrippa I. So he not only would have known because he was in charge of the temple when he shouldn't have been, but he would also have known from his father's knowledge. Bowles stated that Agrippa I rigidly observed all of the Jewish rites, all of their holidays, their rituals. But that didn't mean he was obedient to all the law of Moses. He wasn't. But he did an outward show, much like the Pharisees in Jesus' day, who would go out on the street corner, the busiest street corners they could find in the city, and pray and make a big show of praying to God so that everybody would see them. He wanted them to see that he was at least outwardly obeying all the rituals of the Jews. Also remember that Agrippa's mother was a Jew, and she would have taught Agrippa I all about the Jewish religion. And note that Agrippa then would have known that the Jewish religion, their laws, and he would have known the sects of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He would have known about the groups of the Essenes and all of these. And he would have known their expectations for a Messiah. And he would have known their ceremonial laws. He would have known about Jesus and the claim that he had fulfilled the promises to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He would have known all of these things. And Paul knew it, and he complimented him on his knowledge of these things. But look at Paul's request. So please, because you are knowledgeable, because you know these things, please be patient in your listening to me. The word wherefore in that statement, because you are an expert, goes back to what he just said about being an expert in the customs and the laws, and the questions of the Jews. Strong tells us that this word patiently means with long enduring temper, leniently, patiently. Maybe I don't follow exactly the things that, or the patterns of the way your questions are being asked, but be patient with me. Have you ever done that with someone? They ask you a question and you start somewhere else to lead them to, so they will have a full understanding of their question. Knowing that their question to start with is kind of like, it seemed like almost every congregation I ever went to preach full time, or at least many of them would say, we want to study Revelation. Well, I had to make sure they had enough knowledge so that they could study Revelation. You ever had that happen? Same kind of thing. Be patient with me. I'll get to your questions. I'll answer them. This writer believes that Paul's speech was much, much longer than what we notice here because of the original word's definition. Enduring temperament, with long, enduring temperament and patience and leniency. Our time is just a few minutes away, so let's go ahead and come back next week with verses 4 and 5. We thank you for your patience with my way of doing things.